I come from the financial architecture area, and I will be the chair of this panel. We have a great panel today with us. I'd like to send my greetings to the panelists and those of you who are also connected from around the globe. Our panelists today are experts in the topic, and they're also friends of ours who've been working with us for a long time. They will be sharing their views and analysis of the topic we will be discussing today, which is the role of IFIs in sustainable development funding and in climate matters for the Global South. Before I introduce them, I'd like to highlight that this is a crucial topic, especially now when we're facing multiple crises. And there's a great need to externalize resources in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality and in terms of fairness, so that we can respond to the needs that southern countries have. And in this context, we have many meetings in international spaces to discuss how to resource, how to fund and bridge the funding gaps, the existing funding gaps. Recently, we've had the Financing Commons, the summit, bringing together development banks, public development banks around the world. And they have addressed topics that have to do with channeling resources. This was held in Cartagena not long ago, and we met some of the colleagues we'll have here today for the panel. And we've seen how some discourses similar to the ones we've seen have expressed some general ideas about the matter. On the other hand, we also have to think about the role of the G20. We see how they're trying to promote a larger presence of multilateral banking institutions through their task force. They launched the so-called triple agenda, aiming at a discussion of how to channel resources, be more present, having the private sector more present in multilateral banking agreements. And they even mentioned some figures for them. Only $0.06 of private capital is mobilized of each dollar of this type of banking, but they want to increase that amount. Speaking about, for example, channeling $500 billion in official aid, or official funding rather, for the Agenda 2030, but they want to channel the same amount of money through private sources. And multilateral banking has an important role to play in channeling more resources, but they're telling us that we'll be doing it through non-concessional lending. So the caution is triggered, the alarms are triggered by this. And we will have some meetings in the future. The UN, for example, in a few days, they will be having the General Assembly. And then the annual banking meetings. So we have so many things to discuss. I will just leave it here and I will introduce the first panelist, Maria Jose Romero, the European Debt and Development Network. She's responsible for advocacy in the field of development funding. She will be discussing the role of IFIs in bridging the gap in development funding in the Global South. I'd like to mention as well that you also have interpreting into English and Spanish available. You just have to access the interpretation globe on your panel. Jose, you have 16 minutes to introduce the topics you would like to address this morning. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll start my presentation on behalf of the seminar. Good morning, everyone. I hope that you can see my presentation all right. I have a presentation to share with the audience just to help you follow some of the points I'll be making. So we'll be sharing it, and as Rodolfo was saying, I will be sharing some reflections regarding the role of IFIs in bridging the gaps in development funding for countries in the global south. And we will have other colleagues discussing each of the items in more detail. So we'll just mention some of the general topics right now. First, I would like to share some general reflections regarding the context in which we're in. And the context can be summarized with this general statement, saying that after a pandemic, we have the war, and then they were already happening in a context of debt and climate crisis. I'll be discussing this briefly. Then I will be discussing the role of IFIs and some reform proposals, some of the main features of those reforms, some concerns, and the changes we think are needed. When we speak about the context, I was saying that we're in a context in which after the COVID pandemic, we got into a situation of war. In 2020, when the COVID outbreak started, the Commerce and Trade Commission of the UN spoke of a risk of another lost decade that could bring down the ambition of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. Then we had the war in the Ukraine, and that led to increased uncertainty in terms of social and economic terms, and that the situation became even more complex. CEPAL just a few days ago announced that for the Latin American Caribbean countries, the forecast is bleak from an economic perspective. It's a context of low growth, 1.7% for this year, and even lower for next year, 1.5%. But as I was saying, this is a situation, we're facing a situation that has been brewing for a few years now, a situation of low growth in some countries that was happening before the war. What I'm actually interested in highlighting regarding this latest CEPAL report is that they explicitly mention the connection between the different crises when the executive secretary of CEPAL states that the low growth of Latin America and the Caribbean can be aggravated by the negative effects of the sharpening of the effects of climate shocks if there aren't any investments to adapt and mitigate climate change for the countries. That's what will happen. No doubt we're facing multiple crises right now and interconnected, interlocking crises. What is the role of IFIs in this? What are the proposals for the reform, and why are we facing a situation in which these reform proposals are being presented? To begin with, there's a relative consensus, even in official bodies, regarding the fact that the response that these institutions are given to the crisis have been insufficient. Civil society institutions have highlighted many times that there's lack of self-criticism in the institutions in terms of the contribution to the situation in which the countries in the global south are in right now, in these interconnected, interlocking crises. These institutions, in the response to the crisis, they reinforced practices that were negative, and many times they introduce very limited innovation in their responses. Therefore, the response by financial institutions to the crisis was inadequate, and it has led to a questioning of their own role and also the governance. And there is a very valid question in this regard by the civil society. We ask ourselves, whose interests do they serve, these multilateral development banks and international funding institutions? What development model are they proposing? This lack of self-criticism leads us to question their role. And in many cases, all these questions and challenges have led to different calls for reform of these financial institutions. But what kind of reforms are we discussing? What kind of reforms are we talking about? This is what I'd like to focus on today. I'm not going to go into the details in terms of the different proposals, but I would like to highlight that the G20, as Rodolfo was saying at the beginning, suggested already a year ago that there was a need to reform the multilateral development banks and also the International Bank. And this is in a process of reform with a so-called roadmap for community engagement. In Paris at the end of June, Emmanuel Macron also called for a global financial pact during the Paris summit. And there's also the Bridgestone initiative proposed by the First Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley. This is a proposal, a developing proposal, a proposal in progress that aims at a reform of the financial institutions and the multilateral development banks. But these three proposals and some others that we could mention and add to the list have a couple of things in common. First, these proposals focus on increasing funding and responding to the needs, to the current needs of a context marked by the pandemic, a war in Europe, the impact of inflation in the whole world. This is the thread, this is the common thread that these proposals have, the proposals that we have on the table right now. But there's another one, which is even more important for us, and we need to keep it in mind. And it's that these three proposals, apart from their differences, which are quite remarkable in terms of the political agenda behind them, especially the Bridgestone initiative, it does have a political agenda in terms of the reform that's coming from the global south, and this is an important push. But as I was saying, beyond that, in many of the proposals that we have on the table, we see this an apparent blind faith on the financial markets to comply with climate, to accomplish climate and development objectives. And this blind faith is what we need to question. And we also need to consider it in terms of its implication, both for the development and climate objectives. There seems to be a resurgence of the agenda that the Global Bank, the World Bank mentioned, from thousands of millions to billions. This was reviewed by the World Bank and other multilateral banks with the exclusive support of G20. But now, many years later, we see that this agenda has been unsuccessful. However, we seem to be seeing a resurgence of this agenda. We've seen, for example, renewed interest in the promotion of public-private entities or partnerships. They use public resources with private funding, bonds, and other strategies to reduce risk. What are our main concerns regarding the agenda? I'd like to highlight 6 of them today, 6 points, 6 items regarding our concerns. The agenda is based on the adoption of public policies and funding mechanisms that would enable private sector intervention in development. The concerns that we'll be highlighting now focus on a right-based approach. What are the implications of this agenda if we think about ensuring human rights, guaranteeing human rights? First, there's a poor or complete absence of participation of civil society organizations in these processes. Now, this has an impact as well on the proposals that are being discussed and the content and the features of each of these proposals. Secondly, these proposals are based on an expanded role of lending. And that's especially problematic in the context in which we have high interest rates and gradual and chaotic processes with a never-ending debt restructuring process. We're in a situation in which we're not in a situation in which we can bridge the debt gap. These processes are always seen in the framework of the proposals of G20, that are not seen from the perspective of developing countries. Thirdly, there is a problematic notion of the role of the state. Development is seen as a matter of how to reduce the risk of private investment instead of how to comply with the development goals, with the goals of providing drinking water, infrastructures, education, healthcare services. Fourth, there are some distribution-related impacts that we should not overlook. The tax resources that are used to reduce the risk of private investors can be high, such as, for example, in private-public partnerships. And the total privatization of public goods can restrict universal access to services, as the services I've mentioned, education, health. They have to be understood as rights. My 5th point is that the promotion of policies to foster the so-called alignment with climate objectives, the Paris Agenda, has the risk of pushing countries towards a green structural adjustment. I'm sure that Federico can enlighten us a little bit more about this item regarding the proposal that the IMF is presenting in this sense. This is highly problematic as well. And the 6th element is what's happening with the financial hemorrhaging from the south to the north. And I'm talking about illicit, illegal flows, tax evasion. I'm also talking about the trade agreements, investment agreements that are unfair, unbalanced, or that are in favor or biased towards corporations. What happens with the commitments, existing commitments of donors in terms of development and climate funding? These commitments have been unmet in recent years. So we have all these commitments and these concerns, which are of course relevant because the situation of the countries, of the situation of the global south, should end up having reduced tax spaces due to these flows from the south to the north that I was mentioning before. Therefore, when we come to the changes that we need and what role institutions, financial institutions, international financial institutions should play to bridge these gaps, first, we know that southern countries need more funding. Banks and financial institutions have a clear role to play in this matter. But no doubt, private funding for development is not what we're striving for, it's not what we're needing, but more public funding in non-concessional conditions, especially in terms of climate action. The business model of the multilateral development banks should look to definancialize development instead of going deeper into this problematic process of making it financial, and this goes against the rights.
The fundamental infrastructure should not be dependent on the market. The northern countries, we should be looking at systemic problems. These are debt relief, and we should be looking at international financing. And to end, just as Rodolfo was saying, in the next weeks and months, we will have the UN General Assembly and COP28. However, I'd like to leave you with the idea that what we need is a fourth UN assembly around development and financing that would allow us to have this conversation in an inclusive space where all the countries are represented as equals, and where we would have a space to provide content and to be able to actively participate in that debate, to be able to come to a financial architecture or structure that would fulfill the needs of global South countries. Thank you so much. Thank you, Maria Jose. A very complete and thorough presentation with some main points around the context, the crisis that we are facing, and the call for reform of these financial institutions. So civil society has much to work on, and there are many changes that, in order to definance or defund, that we not continue to finance these development objectives that destroy the climate. And these spaces like the UN, that spaces of development, this fourth conference that will be taking place, we do need it to address all of these topics. So let's move on to our next panelist, Enrico Sibaja from Psychos, who is part of the campaign of the IMF, or facing the IMF, and his role in the architecture of financing and climate change. Federico, welcome. Here is his presentation. We're going to be listening for 10 minutes. Thank you so much, Rodolfo. Thank you, Maria Jose, for all of the points that I think is so important to talk about. There are 3 points here that we need to talk about. Why we have this agenda now, the lack of criticism of the institutions, and all the interests that are at play, and who has the most influence in this case, the IMF. And it's impressive because from G20, there's this desire to continue in these institutions. What they need is that the IMF continue to play this role in these international financing networks. I'm going to move on to the topics of the current issues around the IFIs and the fund. First, we need to understand that the IMF does not participate in this. But basically, they are like a last resource, supposedly to save and rescue countries that have an international need for international funds. And this, of course, comes with conditions and policies, and guarantees that the countries pay back, right? This is not always like this, and it's just like taking for granted that these loans come with conditions, when this is really shouldn't be this way. It should be decided in a way that is sovereign and democratic. In the Bretton Woods Agreement, international funds can decide on development of countries. Here we can also see a little bit what Maria Jose was saying, how decisions are made in the IMF. We can see that the US, the United Kingdom, and European countries, Japan, have more than 50% of decision-making power in the IMF, and that's what we can discuss in the end. And I'm sure Luis will talk more about this. Also, just to understand a bit more about the situation that we're in, about the IMF, what Maria Jose was speaking. We know what happened in the 80s, what the IMF and the World Bank did in the structural adjustment policies. And then the rise of the price of commodities, and many countries decided to distance themselves from the IMF. Many countries decided to go to the market but to not be able to not have to face the conditions and the policies of the IMF, because there were certain interests that were pushing them to certain directions. But with the crisis and the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, many countries found themselves in a situation where they had to go back to the IMF. And IMF is a fund in the last few years, just like in the 80s and 90s, they were able to privatize new fields like businesses. They can really change employment policies, which are not part of the IMF, but they're continuing to expand the political space where they can make changes, included the macro critique, right? Just like questions of gender and other things. What is the problem? The IMF, in its search for stability, the macroeconomic stability, which is a debatable topic because it's the sustainability of macroeconomics in the short term without thinking about what the impacts of these in terms of social well-being and the climate. The IMF takes climate change as a factor that can affect this macroeconomic stability. So they just make policies based on this. What's the problem? They are denying the ability to look at how the macroeconomics and the short term can negatively affect countries that go towards the green transition for the long term. This is an instrument that becomes, in the media, they're talking about the IMF as if it's transforming, that is part of the vanguard to change and to be able to meet our climate goals. So in 2022, the goal of this is to look at the long-term goals that countries may have, specifically around climate change and the pandemic. And most importantly, it is climate change. We can talk about this later, but the special rights of these have specific, the IMF doesn't have any expertise around climate. So they're designing policies in sectors that are new for them. And there is risk for this. We can see in the first accords that were announced in October of last year until now. One of the favorite policies, of course, of the IMF is reducing subsidies, right? We can see in certain sectors, we need to see that gradually there needs to be a reduction in subsidies, a way that green energy does grow. But from the IMF, there is a limiting in this. So they reducing subsidies, just thinking about finances without thinking about the impacts on gender inequality or different regions, negative impacts in the climate. It's also a hypocrisy because we're looking at asking countries to reduce their subsidies when Europe raises $220 billion in subsidies, right? The incentives, in the case of Kosovo, it's for the renewing their, in Kosovo, the coal plant with the IMF. And then in Kosovo, there are changes in trying to get, oh, yes? The interpreters are asking us to please speak slower. Thank you. I'm gonna also talk about how these institutions are trying to transform and create new instruments or new tools without looking at what the problems they've generated in the past decades and the impact it has in countries to fulfill their commitments to human rights. In IMF with Argentina, it's very clear. Last year and this year, there was a drought, which had an impact on exportations with $220 billion less of an impact on exportations. And this ended in the IMF, which decided that the IMF was not going to adjust goals for this drought, and so there had to be public spending, and that meant a reduction in energy subsidies and also financing of the health sector and the education sector. In the IMF, there has been an increase in funding for the gas pipeline, and then of course, if we're looking at fossil fuels for many more years, to understand the social and economic impacts of exporting oil. No, they're expecting to go in just 6 years, a huge change in exports. The mining and coal industry, there were a few processes in the last few months that were in Vaca Muerta in the south of the country for the gas pipeline. The institutions should have responded. I'm going to continue here. And just to finish up, G20, the goal is to have bigger institutions. They talk about reform, but not transformation. It's very dangerous when we think about giving them more financial power to these institutions who are going to continue to make the mistakes that they did in the past. In the case of the IMF, and the World Bank and the development, there's not even an independent accountability source. There's an office of evaluation that gives information, but it doesn't lead the IMF to have any sort of growth or learning. There is no reason that they're not repeating or doing anything once again. So in terms of financing and derechos de giro has also been blocked in the Congress in the US. many know that they can give these without any conditions. They can allow countries to pay for the transformation of energy. And just as we said, it is very unequal. And there are many parts of civil society that relates social adjustment policies with countries in G7 and asking what are the countries, which companies, where are these companies from, and many times they are from the IMF. And then the IMF in the debt crisis, this is a very technical tool, but it's an opportunity to see how this is working and when we're looking at whether the countries need to restructure their debt, what are the obligations in terms of human rights and the climate crisis, in health and in education. And that has made countries like Argentina that have a very unsustainable debt situation without recognizing the need to find solutions and alternatives instead of continuing to pressure territories and pressuring retired people and pressuring people to pay higher and higher taxes. And that's where I leave it. Thank you so much, Jose. Just like Maria Jose was saying, the IMF and how, and just responding to how these policies lead our countries to continue to be subject to these policies and austerity measures and these reforms that are needed to have an IMF that really responds to the needs of countries and not just the financial needs of these great, so that they do lend money, these entities that lend money. And we're going to continue on to our next panelist, Ivana La Rosa, International Coordinator. She's going to talk to us about last week in Cartagena. We're going to talk about in the region, the development. You're going to have 10 minutes. Sorry that we have to continue on. We have to talk a little bit slower, please, for our interpreters. And just to remind you that there's going to be a sector for questions as well.
Okay, thank you, Rodolfo. Hi, everyone, colleagues. I'll try to speak as slowly as possible, but I apologize in advance. Like all my colleagues from the South were quite fast talkers. Anyway, for those who are listening to us and who might not be familiar with the Financing Commons Summit, it was the 4th edition this year in Cartagena de Indias. And this was a few days ago. It started in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. And with the development banks, both national and multilateral development banks in a region, the Inter-American Development Bank, etc., and also from other regions. At that time, during the first edition of the summit, since the Coalition of Human Rights for Development with other allies, there was a huge coalition of organizations and communities. We were faced with the first dilemma. That is, how banks were getting together to organize a summit to face the different crises with the pandemic, especially without considering the participation of civil society and communities. So from then on, we started some actions to try to open up the space and question the actual way in which developed is conceived as a top-down approach. With Maria Jose and Fede explained this, there are many things that are constantly repeating. and we cannot discuss how we're going to respond to the how the bank can provide solutions if they don't change the format, if they are just going to continue repeating the same kind of roads and recipes, and we cannot get different results if we continue doing what we have always done. To cut a long story short, in the different editions of the summit, we already had some spaces, and they recognize some of our approaches, for example, a human rights-based approach and a community-led development approach. And in the previous editions, the summit already recognized that these approaches had to be considered. So in Cartagena, we managed to get a higher participation of civil society in terms of the possibility to register for the summit. This also meant that we had participation, at least an acceptable participation in some of the items of the agenda. We had some colleagues, some communities, and some panels. I will be mentioning that later. And we had one of our main sessions about a human rights-based approach. So I think that in this case, we always have to be moderate, and in terms of being ambitious about what we want to achieve, but also acknowledging our efforts and how we started permeating those spaces. I think that this year was a change. We saw some change because we were inside the summit. We had a delegation of members and allies, especially representatives from the communities, who were over 40 individuals who were there at the summit. And we had that role, and I think that it's already something positive, because we didn't allow them to have their usual conversations going through rhetorics, and as Michael was saying, banks say that they're giving solutions, that they just talk to one another with concepts that are constantly being repeated without any sort of self-criticism and without criticism. We're, of course, trying to be constructive, but we cannot avoid thinking about the impact on the territory, on the ground. And when we speak about those big ideas, innovation, etc., this brings a different reality on the ground, and we can show it with data. So what we saw in the summit was the same thing, the repetition of this blind trust on the private sector. They repeat the role of public banking in terms of enabling the presence of private money and private funding. So the private sector has a margin for innovation so that they can respond to the multiple crises. And this was something that we questioned at all times, because from a conceptual perspective, we also submitted a report, and I'll post a link later. This is a collaborative report and would like to share it with everyone, and we have shared it with many other activists of over 100 organizations. We developed a report precisely to see what the role of the public development institutions should be. And we presented a criticism with concrete examples showing how the solutions that they are promoting as those that make the difference have not worked. So in terms of the crisis. So through this joint collaborative effort, we managed to show data and conclusions that are drawn from empirical studies and experiences, and we were there to share it, and we were there to make the voices from the ground heard. This is one of the things I'd like to highlight. The role that the private sector is being assigned. And that trust, I'm not sure whether it's blind trust. It can't be blind trust, because if we look at the outcomes, we see the impact that it's had. But it's also a challenge to the paradigm that has been presented, the development paradigm that we've been questioning for a long time, and even inside the summit, we were highlighting this. We cannot respond to the multiple crises that have been generated by the actions of these financial institutions in alliance with the private sector, with the corporations, and that is based on a weakening of the commons and a weakening of public services as human rights. So if we continue with this type of framework, we can't provide any solutions to what we already have. So we have insisted on this during the summit. And it was not just us. It might be very clear for those of us who are in civil society and who work on the ground, who work at the grassroots. But this was emphasized during the closing session, the closing panel with the president of Colombia, Petro, also emphasized this contradiction. And what we see from the perspective of those tools that were seen around the summit in different panels is that we need to go back to concepts such of where innovation comes from, green bonds, private-public partnerships, and how the private sector needs to get flexibility in norms that have been an obstacle today. We've heard that very often. And what we see is that there's a danger when they want to make the framework more flexible. Well, in fact, we need to have a framework that's rigid in terms of the rights of people and that understands the commons and common resources. When we think about the climate crisis and also the associated crisis, we cannot weaken this framework. So this is a concern, and I will encourage you to check out the declaration. I'll paste it on the chat later, and how this goes through these ideas. Everything revolves around this axis. The private sector is key. And with concepts that make us clear to us what the approach is, they speak about the attractiveness for the private sector, bankable projects. So once again, start using these tools, as Marco was saying, of the financialization that is to create products that are set to the market. And the market wants to make profit. This is no secret to anyone. And that's why what we were saying is that to respond to the climate crisis and other associated crises, if we're still looking at the paradigm of profit, then we're going down the wrong path, and we will be sacrificing the lives of people, because those of us who are in the global south facing the consequences of climate change, of poverty, the weakening of the rights, lack of access to education, to healthcare, they're going to be facing this without any tool at their disposal. So this is not a matter of making profit, but making the public development banks at the service of citizens. And we insisted a lot on this idea, and I hope that we hope that at some point this comes through, this message goes through, though this is something we need to work on every day. But we have to insist on the fact that the rights of people are non-negotiable, because otherwise we're not recognizing who are the subjects that are forgotten. The state and public banks are part of these institutions. So there's a global governance that needs to be strengthened with this focus. Who are the subjects who are entitled to rights? So we should not see profit as a response to everything. So that, oh, now we have to make this attractive to the private sector. The private sector needs to adjust to a framework of rights. So who has to conduct surveillance and follow up? I think we still have a difficult battle ahead, though during this summit, as I was saying, we tried to question all this every time we could. And even when we were present as panelists, or even from the floor, taking the floor and or having parallel meetings with the banking representatives. But I think that in a nutshell, we cannot continue thinking that the people responsible for these institutions are oblivious of what happens at the grassroots. Of course, they know that, and we have to work on our advocacy, because we cannot allow them to disassociate the rights framework as something parallel to finance. and the responsibility in terms of the effects on the rights of people at grassroots level, because otherwise we will just be caught in this logic and this profit logic and sacrificing populations, areas for profit, for the profit of others. And we already saw this with the North-South agreement, a trade union with different Latin American countries, and they have projects towards the energy transition, which is not fair for us. It's not a just transition, because we're still going to continue exploiting resources with a predator approach, a capitalist approach, at the expense of the grassroots and generating debt. Then all the tools that are generated, if they generate debt, they're not fair. If they're still exploiting and sacrificing territories, they're not fair. So we've seen there's no questioning of consumption patterns, of North-South relationships, or global governance. So these actors are not questioning this large banks and corporations. We were there to at least try to introduce some of these matters, and also to bring the voices of people who have the specific data of what's happening on the ground. But I think that we need to continue following up the conclusions of the summit and what happens in each of the countries and each of the regions, because we will continue working as well, monitoring and seeing what's happening and at regional and global level. And as you were mentioning, we will see the other moments we'll have, the G20 summit, other meetings and the financial architecture, and also the institutions, Latin America and the global level. So this is a snapshot. It's a snapshot, like I say, that we have managed to permeate the summit a bit, but it's going to take a long time for us to change the paradigm on development. And we still see the emphasis being laid on things that are not appropriate for us, because the emphasis should be laid on getting back to life, getting back to an idea of development in which people are the protagonists, and so that they're clear about the response they should be presenting. So this is a bittersweet summary, but I have to say that we're proud of being part of the summit and also to bring the voices to this space. So of course, this is not enough at all. And I'd leave it here because I know that some of the colleagues were also present in the summit and they might have some more things to say. Thank you. Eva? Yes, but we didn't expect much from the summit. We heard the things that we expected to hear. We spoke about the markets, the capital, even more, and flexibilizing the frameworks still more, as you were mentioning, to attract capital. And I think that human rights has been an important matter. And the voices of civil society, of the grassroots, the territories, we see that their plan is to continue extracting resources. But our comments, they see it as an annex. The main thing is to continue generating profit, being profitable, and every now and then we'll see whether this intersects with rights or not. Another important thing is what Petra said, and Brent has shared this in the chat. I think that somebody also discussed interesting things, but we're not sure whether this is just going to be a matter of words or whether this is going to be translated into something else. But at least we were present, and we hope that will be an opening for us. Okay, we can give the floor now to Carolina Juaneda from the Wealth Information Center. She's the coordinator for Latin America and the Caribbean. And Caro will speak about the problematic aspects of regional aspects in terms of the Amazon forest. And Carol will discuss this. Carol?
Hi, everyone. Just listening to the earlier interventions, I just feel like there's a little bit of deja vu. We've been talking about these questions for a long time, but I feel more and more convinced that the deeper issues here, the structural issues, are not changing, right? There are new initiatives that are being launched and multilateral agreements, there are alliances. But in terms of the structure and how it's operating, how these institutions function, there's very few changes since their founding. I want to talk a little bit about how this Amazon initiative has emerged in 2021 in June, and after the annual meeting in April, there was a great initiative with a lot of effort to conserve the Amazon rainforest. And it was approved, the document was approved to conserve the Amazon rainforest. This was debated between governments, the member states, and the Inter-American Bank. And in an area like the Amazon rainforest, where it's a critical situation, where we know that conservation is really only thanks to the role of Afro-descendants and indigenous people with traditional practices in the conservation of biome or biosphere, nobody in this group was consulted in the initiative of conservation. Not even a conversation was had. It was just like a vertical design where things, or it was a hierarchical design where things were where there was decisions about financing towards the Amazon rainforest. There were 4 pillars that were identified. One was in human capital, green infrastructure, agriculture and sustainability, administration and management of forests. And this was problematic because, as we see in the founding documents, it was defined in terms of economics, bioeconomics, right? Which leads to homogenizing forests, monocultures, and in cultivation, in cultivating and harvesting, and using human capital. And without prioritizing the bioeconomics of indigenous people that is based on the planet, that is holistic, that reduces and reproduces the the diversity of the rainforest. So other organizations that were allies, we raised our voices and we said, what is going on here? And we really took some steps back. And one of these steps back was that they said, okay, let's start to include the voices of Amazon rainforest residents, which was a good thing. We saw this as a good thing. And in one of the funds, the multi-donor funds, we said, okay, we're going to directly give resources to indigenous peoples of the rainforest. Because what we were seeing is this initiative was giving us a sense of deja vu, right? Like this has happened before. And it was a abysmal support for the private sector. They were giving way more support, financial support, to bigger businesses instead of the small indigenous rainforest communities. So the first thing that we see is that we wanted it to basically prioritize or channel resources to be managed by indigenous communities, and that their very own initiatives were the ones that would be supported, their own economies. They were not direct financing for these things. Some of these, and one of the in the multi-donor fund, for instance, which is part of this umbrella of the Amazon initiative. It's not actually called the Amazon initiative anymore. There's been a rebranding. There's with the new International Development Bank, it's called Amazon Forever. So in terms of conceptual ideas, it's about where they're going and everything is the same, but it's just a rebranding. And now they have really thought about the mistakes that they've made in the past. And so now, for instance, they are recognizing, and they've had a debate around with indigenous people in the Amazon and how they define themselves and how to support projects of indigenous bioeconomy. And the multi-donor fund, one of the funds that's in this framework of this initiative, and based on all the funds that can come together, a minimum of 23% should be it should be given to Amazon rainforest indigenous peoples initiatives, so they can decide on their own how to use those funds, or they can do it with the support of an intermediary organization, but they have to be giving their consent. But also, it's the very least that can be done, right? It's like these spaces where the people are supported. We know who historically has been doing conservation for the rainforest. It hasn't been the government or the banks. But what works is what supports and what helps co-design with the people, with these indigenous communities. So what's interesting here is that this initiative emerges without consulting, without a dialogue, without a minimal dialogue with these peoples, with indigenous people. So another thing that we're seeing, and we found out in the financing comment, is there's going to be a new coalition called the Green Coalition, where there are public banks in development, there are bilateral development, they're gathering funds also to approach the main challenges that the Amazon is facing, right? And that's what they talk about here. They were private banks and public development banks and multilateral banks. I didn't see any of the communities or indigenous communities or Afro-descendant communities present, right? But these multilateral banks, what they say is they have the ability to, bring finances, make decisions, and finance the development. But the issue here is there's a symbolic resistance and a real resistance to include communities who are supposedly going to benefit from these initiatives to be part of the decision-making processes. How are these programs going to be structured? How are these initiatives going to be carried out? And how are these funds going to come to the territory? So just to kind of summarize here, this is a very a huge undertaking facing the private finance system. They have been able to, they have really undermined the role of the Amazon community. There is an inequality here that is part of the initiatives. And these three funds that are continuing to be built to mobilize, as they say, towards the Amazon rainforest. What we're seeing here still is that there is financing and funding, but it's again, they're always prioritizing private financing instead of what is going to benefit directly the Amazon people. And this, of course, needs to be changed, but it does not change. So I think really it needs to be the decision-making process needs to be more democratic, and the institutions and these funds that are being created to for money around climate change, if it doesn't change here, the same thing will be repeated over and over again, the same problems over and over again. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Caro. Yeah, there is a vision here that is the same that we are continuing to observe regarding what these banks, the International Development Bank and the World Bank, what they are doing is continuing to, like what we're all talking about here, their development that they believe in without taking into account the communities, channeling money without and resources. And they continue to make up these institutions and these initiatives, the Green Coalition, but they do not consider those who are truly historically present in the Amazon. And they're really suffering the impacts of these structural models. Thank you, Carol. And we're going to listen to Luis Veda from Brentwood Project. They continue to look at the IMF and the World Bank. And we're going to listen here. The interpreter is struggling to hear the speaker. Luis, the mic is all yours. He's going to speak in Spanish. He was going to speak in English, but now in Spanish. Sorry, I was in a conference in Sao Paulo, and it was it's hard to find a calm place. Sorry for the noise. It's interesting because my presentation will continue in similar topics that have been discussed here. The idea about regarding the initiative here in the World Bank is the origins were in the pandemic. The conflict in Ukraine, and the growing tension and the climate crisis. The interpreter is struggling to hear the speaker. The interpreter is still having trouble hearing the speaker. And through integrating, calculating human rights within the World Bank. Even though the members speak outside of the commitments of the World Bank. It's interesting. The document in itself that was presented in the development of the bank. The last World Bank. Their origins are in the
Now, as Maria Jose mentioned, we see the opinion of the UN, when speaking about a loss in development. They started long before the COVID pandemic. And this is a very important point. It's a conflicting point. We also have to underline what kind of context we're in now. For the first time, there's a reduction in poverty, 120, and it has increased. 120 million more people have become poor. Now we have levels of inequality. We're sorry, but the speaker's connection is too bad. We cannot follow what he's saying. We apologize. In a report, the state of nutrition in 2023, analyzed that 183 million people do not have enough to eat, and over 3 billion do not have a healthy diet. As Maria Jose mentioned, we've underlined this several times. The world is also in a crisis of hostility that endangers, in a sustainability crisis that endangers the lives of thousands of people. In a report of 2023 on commodity dependence, I think the 101 of 191 member states of the UN are still commodity dependent. Another 14 have over 50% of their exports based on basic products. I mentioned this because we haven't seen for decades a structural change in the economies of medium and low income countries, which is the objective of the World Bank, at least in theory. As I mentioned, the roadmap response to public crisis from the World Bank is framed by the pandemic, the war in the Ukraine, and other events that are beyond their control. They are exogenous elements. And I think that we need to highlight that this roadmap acknowledges this development crisis and indicates the World Bank's role as one of its main institutions in the development, with its funding, with its different adaptations. But it is weird because after doing all this and acknowledging the crisis, they do not establish a logical link that due to their key position in the world of global development, they do not link their political actions to the crisis in development. So there's a lack of consistency, philosophical consistency in the document itself, and we need to acknowledge that. And this is one of the most important elements, critiques to the document. There's a lack of empirical base. How can we have a reform, a development-based reform, when there is no empirical base? The document goes deeper into the role of the private sector in what they call a cascading effect. The document does not acknowledge nor mention, not even in theory, that the previous World Bank policies, such as the structural adjustment plans, the tax projects, the lack of attention to their effects, could have at least contributed to the current crisis. And this is a key element. And as Maria Jose mentioned as well, the roadmap does not acknowledge a pact to change the world financing governance structure, or it does not entrust the states to play a role in the development through, for example, even industrial policies. When the World Bank speaks about governance and strengthening institutions, it speaks as if the countries exist outside of the global system, as if they were just in charge of domestic matters. The document does not include a structural analysis of the problems. And something else related to this, with a flagrant omission that I just mentioned, we also see that despite the different discussions, such as BRICS agenda, or the role of the BRICS, the roadmap does not include the strength of global South countries or the difficulties in accessing their structures. I also think that we should highlight that one of the things that make this and that makes our agenda more difficult is that the roadmap process can be seen in the declaration of leaders of G20 leaders. But there are some statements by global South countries regarding world governance. There's also an agreement amongst them regarding this agenda of changing billions of dollars into trillions of dollars. The leaders of the global South also have this idea. They want larger development banks, getting funding even in unfavorable conditions. And another important thing we have to highlight is that the development of this roadmap of the World Bank was faced with the opposition of some global South countries who see the climate agenda as neo-colonial. They're scared that this new agenda will decrease attention to poverty, which is something important for medium and low income countries. The roadmap has become a debate on funding and how to create better development banks, and especially a better World Bank. That is to create larger and better banks, but focusing almost exclusively in the bigger side of the dyad. And it most of the time focuses on technical solutions to increase the volume of lending, of credit, through different innovations. Sorry. Although the roadmap speaks about the need to follow a model that supports public banks, development banks for the future, they just focus on the billion to trillion agenda. They want to materialize this despite generalized skepticism, not just people from the left, but from other walks of life as well. But this is an important matter because it's been mentioned in a document that we introduced for the consultation process during the development of the roadmap. The whole document is based on 4 landmarks for the cascade. 1, there's not enough public funding to face the current needs. The cascading approach is more profitable than the public approach, and what it creates is more sustainable. The cascade is necessary for global climate action, and a cascade is the most reliable political pathway to face these conflicting crises. Instead of challenging the different myths or at least addressing criticism, these institutions look for ways to reduce risk. There's a whole discussion around de-risking, but the word de-risking in English seems to imply that risk is going to disappear, but what's happening is that the risk is getting transferred from the private sector to the public sector. And due to the fact that there is this idea of turning billions into trillions, there's no update. And I think that we should ask ourselves to what extent states will have to face the risk of those investments from the private sector. And this is a key aspect for me. And despite the evidence that we have, this shows the need for the private sector to conduct safe investment with a clear risk profitability ratio. This does not fit with the view that we've seen and the track record of these institutions. And that's why this document is so questionable. Most likely, the attention that they're paying to the cascade and its contribution to the funding of the different international and global institutions will aggravate the inequality in terms of wealth and the capacity for the states to stimulate the real economy. And we see that this is going to introduce more pressure on the most fragile sectors of the population, as we have seen with the increased numbers of protests and social fragmentation. I think I'll leave it here and now I'm open to questions. And I apologize because I was speaking in half Portuguese. My sound was terrible and I was not very clear.
Thank you, Luis. We understand perfectly. And thanks for speaking and transmitting your ideas in Spanish. I'm left with the idea that you mentioned about this focus on a cascade, the focus that goes moving down from one level to the next. If the project is not profitable, then we look at how to make it profitable. On the one hand, if it's not profitable for this hand, then we're continuing looking how to make it profitable. And in that dynamic, they're promoting, they're from public to the private sector, right? These structural adjustment policies are continuing to be promoted by the World Bank, and this roadmap is definitely worsening the policies and the concerns that we have as a civil society, that how the climate agenda, as you mentioned, is seen as something that is neocolonial, that where we want to have greater investments, but they're not based in technical pieces they're just about bringing money for certain sectors. So the private sector really deepens their profits, and it's like continuing to have the role that the World Bank had within the Latin America in the 80s or the 90s, continued to promote mining and policies that showed that the recipe to promote extractivism economics will continue, right? So I'd like, Luis, if you could share again the document of the consultation, the consult that they made. That would be wonderful to share that document. And now we're going to look at the questions. We have 3 questions in the chat. I'm going to read them. they're not directed to anyone in particular. What is the role of the local communities and indigenous communities in the framework of the IFIs? Santiago Obispo asked this question. We spoke about this a bit, but maybe, and then I'm going to try to translate this here. Can the speakers give us insights on the political agenda and the key processes they see to push the reforms needed? And then the last one is the social society, the civil society of Latin America. Can they be moved closer to CEPAL? If it could be more, if it could be a good thing to strengthen our voice in this context, if we gather forces. So let's go in order. If you would like to, Maria Jose, who can you answer any of the questions here? The first question? Yes, thank you. Sorry. It's really loud. Okay. Yes, thank you for these questions. I also wanted to say that this conversation is really rich and just regarding the questions, I'd like to answer the question that is referring to what are the opportunities, the political opportunities, and the main processes that we can really, where we can really advance the necessary reforms. At the end of my presentation, I mentioned a few of these, and I think they were also spoken about by other people in other moments today. I think in all of the official processes that can be from, you know, what's going to happen this week, next week in the UN General Assembly, or the yearly meetings, annual meetings for the World Bank and the IMF meeting in mid-October, and then the UN conference on climate change, the COP28. There's also going to be another round of conversations in the UN about development, and there's a new forum. In all of these official spaces, I think it's necessary to work on a process, like Ivana had said, to really raise our voices, to have a relevant participation of civil society, both within, in the outside and in the inside, working either with the press, and really just trying to raise consciousness around these topics. Seminars like this one are really helpful in that way, because often we are facing a lot of official meetings and different, more and more gatherings and processes, conferences, and they're not very critical spaces, and there's really a lack of spaces to raise our voices, right? So I think we have to really think about how to use these spaces so that they no longer are only just like an official formal space. So we're just trying to raise our voices and talk about topics that are concerned for us. When we think about the IMF, maybe Federico can speak more about this, but I just wanted to say that at the end of this year, there's going to be a debate process around the reform and adjustment of quotas and the members of the IMF. I think that's one of the spaces of governance It's one of the opportunities to talk about governance and about finances. And we can talk about recapitalization of the multilateral banks that are always relevant for civil society. And we can really talk about our concerns, raise our concerns. Or like we can say, okay, more money, what do we need this more money for? How much money is it? It's not just how much money, which is important, but what is this going to be used for and who's going to benefit, right? We're also going to be facing the recapitalization of the World Bank and other multilateral banks. And just two more phrases related to the question that Rocio asked around CEPAL. And I think that, yes, it is really important to talk about the ECLAC. It is important, and a lot of the criticisms that came from the UN came towards the UN come from the ECLAC, so CEPAL in Spanish. So thank you. Thank you, Marco. There's a question here from Brent in the chat. What are the possibilities of involvement of organizations of the civil society in the building of strategies and IFIs as in the World Bank and the World International Development Bank as a way to overcome the debate limits of individual projects? I'm gonna be brief here, and I'm just gonna repeat a little bit what Maria Jose was explaining and what when we're talking about civil society and how to build in these topics, because it seems like in the next few months, all the reforms around IFIs will be defined. And when we talk about these principal countries that decide, they're not always the ones who are participating, because it's a very limited space for civil society to participate. So it seems to me like the efforts really need to be focused now, and also the political context is really difficult. I think it's really more important to build more spaces like what we're talking about, financing in common and civil society spaces, generating pressure in European Union. And it seems like we need to define it more on our end, and to think about this double process of how to really build different political processes, new political processes that really questions and innovates and transforms, because often we kind of get lost in the ultra technical piece of the political processes, and we kind of lose our audience and we lose the opportunity to work together and to collaborate. So thank you so much. Thank you, Fede. We also have a question from Patricia Molina from Bolivia, from Fobomade, around economy in the States. What would the impacts be specifically in this? Like the International Development Bank recently in Galapagos Islands became a guarantor. Exchange of debt is not a new thing, but there are new private ways that the International Development Bank have been using these. I don't know if there's a comment on this regard. And then just the last minute we have here. What do you think about the short-term future of the climate financing system of the IFIs and the need to create a new fund directed at recognizing losses and damages? I don't know if we have some information regarding this and we can talk about it. Eva, please. Yes, I'm gonna be kind of brief and not repeat what anyone else has said. So what Fede was saying before, As civil society, speaking from this coalition, we talk with our allies, we work with our allies in our communities, we feel this pressure, all of us, and we cannot be in all of the conferences because we don't even have the resources. We don't have the resources that these organizations and financial institutions, states have to lobby, to raise money. So that already means that we have to be very strategic. The organizations and the communities really need to think, where do we decide to direct our pressure? And then to have this map here, I'm gonna link it to the second question. Where are all of these conferences, but where are we gonna decide to advocate, right? So our states are already are representing us, are supposedly to represent us in a lot of these conferences. And when do we ask for accountability, right? So I think the coordination here, share our notes, right? We cannot, any organization be in all the agendas, right? But all together we can. We're in different organizations, we're in different processes, national processes. So I think this is really a call, once again, to continue collaborating just like we have been, but to continue to improve and to take care of each other and take care of ourselves and know that we have limits. We have limits. But yeah, continue to share our knowledge and know, okay, who's doing what, and let's do this shared map. Let's create this shared map and continue to repeat our demands in all the places that we can, nationally, regionally, and internationally. That to me seems to be crystal clear. And the role of communities is also the same one, right? The communities have the ones who they are protagonists, they have agency. And from the perspective of the coalition, there are members, there are allies, they're part of everything. But whenever possible, it's also politically very important because it's what those who are day to day, who are in the details, and who have the concrete information, the specific information, the difference between these discussions and what happens in reality. So of course, the question of the EAC-LAC or CEPAL in Spanish, or the Inter-American Bank, when we think about the agenda that is coming down the road and these different forums that are happening, we're also thinking, okay, what is finance in common going to do, and what's happening with the International Development Bank in March of 2024. There's going to be other conferences that were already mentioned in Finances in Common in Colombia in 2025. There's going to be a CELAC with the European Union. There's going to be a meeting, and these are not isolated moments. This is where these agreements are reached, and they continue to impact in all different issues that relate to the crisis that we are denouncing, that we are speaking about. So I think that, yeah, we don't have, we have to, we don't have options. We have to see what strategy we use, but we also need to continue to preserve our energy and use our resources collectively, because it's not just one organization or one group that can address all of this. We have to come together. And I need to repeat it, not as rhetoric, but as a real conscious effort that we need to continue to share notes, continue to share these agendas. And like we're doing, what we were saying, all the decisions of the COP meetings and the loss and damages, we have a lot of colleagues who are over there. So then how do we continue to fit in what we're doing? And that's really where we're going to be able to see this engineering, this social and strategic engineering, so that we can continue to put in practice, put this into practice. So once again, we have a lot of pressure on us. We have to continue demanding international cooperation. When we were talking about the International Development Bank, as an example, how do we make sure that these countries and organizations are asking for this type of cooperation? It's one small drop after the other. But also we can't make it easy for them to make decisions without the real participation, the true participation of the protagonists and the people who are affected. I'm not saying anything new, but that's what I think that we need to continue to do, is just improving our strategies. I'm sorry, Rodolfo, just to say, the question of, in the case of the World Bank, we can add our own opinion and to demand that the government does consult with civil society. What we've seen often is that those consults are really poor, they're weak. And in some cases that we've seen real consultation, what we've seen in the end is that everything is documented and they're very robust results. But then when the government speaks one-on-one to the bank and says, hey, you know what, I need money for this project, they just speak about it between between the bank and the state, and they're not really taking into account. They kind of find an argument to make it and justify it. But yes, I think that definitely the banks need to, they're strengthening their relationships for the future, but they're just another tool. And putting all of our expectations there, it doesn't seem like a good idea, because when they want to do something, they find their justification however they can. It is interesting though that the BEAD, on the other hand, does not have to consult anything. They're not forced to consult anything, right? So if we want to make them consult, then we have to have a call around how to think about strategies. There are 3 pillars that are defined. And that is what defines what projects are going to happen and what are not. So I think we have to decide to really read and look at these documents so that civil society and communities are participating, and so that they have a voice, and to see what the priorities for development are and how they should be financed. And then it should be respected, right? During whatever time that strategy remains in the country. Thank you, Caro and Luis. We'll just leave it to you to finish up. Thank you. Just questions around banks and insurances, right? I think it would be interesting in our community to focus on the structural changes of the economy from the 80s till now, and the refinancing of the economy, because this question of creating new tools and new vehicles to ensure and then create new markets, etc. It doesn't only give a answer to the climate crisis, but even the economic structure. I think this is linked to what Federico was mentioning, is the political strategy. And then to what point the global south, or those that represent the global south, represent another model. In my opinion, that is not the case. Ana Garcia Patrick Bunds, they say the sub-imperialism structures, the center of the periphery, and then the periphery, right? Because it's not understood then from the 70s to create an alliance between countries, developing countries. But now we see that this process was co-opted. So I'd like to talk about the topic of a neoliberal project that happened what happened in this state. One of the parts of the roadmap in the Cascades, it's also what we talked about, right? The lack of transparency. But also in the private sector, it's necessary and more efficient and more trustworthy than the public sector, which is corrupt and etc. And maybe not among us here, but if you speak to people on the street or other people of the civil society, that they have this idea is really powerful. So we have to really try to talk about this issue and broaden our networks. And it is, we focus on individual projects and individual rights, but not as much on structural policy. So we need to really strengthen these connections. And for us as civil society members in the Global South, our challenge is really to raise consciousness for those in the Global North and the inhabitants of the richer countries. Show them they have an interest in changing the economic structure. That's a really big challenge, in my opinion, because I live in London. In London, they talk a lot about the economic crisis, but nobody on the street links that crisis with the global system, right? With the global economic system. And that makes our life a lot harder. It makes it harder to pressure the government to change their policies. So in summary, we have our work cut out. Thank you. And everything that you talked about really shows us that there are so many challenges and a lot of work to be done. And defining and prioritizing development is one of the ideas here. And this dynamic around the Global South and the Global North, the hemisphere, the periphery in the center, the margins in the center, and how they can be tools to kind of maintain this model, right? Just as we're seeing. And then the question really would be now, what would be the role of the private sector and how to get more participation from the civil society, of course, by the communities that are more affected by these projects. I want to thank you all of our panelists and our speakers. Thanks to our interpreters. This has been live streamed on Facebook. You can watch it on Facebook afterwards. And also to just say that this seminar is part of a series of events that we've been doing that will continue in the beginning of October, financing, climate change, on different topics about the market. We're going to continue talking about these topics. I want to thank you all, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Big hugs. Thank you.